Good morning, everybody, wherever you're watching this from. So there is a major development brewing right now around Iran's Kharg Island. And if you've been following this war since it kicked off back in February, you know this island is basically the beating heart of everything Iran has left. We're going to break down why the US military appears to be gearing up to do something huge here. What huge actually means in military terms, what assets are already sitting in the region ready to do it, and why this specific island, this specific 30 million barrel patch of coral rock in the northern Persian Gulf, might be the single most important piece of terrain in the entire conflict right now. Stick with me, because there's a lot to unpack. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly why Kharg Island has become the flashpoint that everyone in the Pentagon, everyone in Tehran, and honestly, everyone trading oil futures around the world is watching right now. So let's set the stage first, because you have to understand what Kharg actually is before you understand why it matters this much. Kharg Island sits about 20 miles off Iran's mainland coast in the northern Persian Gulf. It's small, it's coral, and for most of its history it was basically nothing. But starting in the 1960s, Iran turned it into its primary crude oil loading facility, and by the mid-2020s, that terminal had grown to the point where it could load 10 supertankers simultaneously. Today, it handles somewhere around 90% of Iran's total oil exports. 90%. That's not a typo, that's not an exaggeration. That is the actual number analysts use. The island hosts the Falat Iran Oil Company terminal, which alone processes roughly 500,000 barrels of crude a day, plus the Kharg Petrochemical Company facility right next to it. Storage capacity on the island sits around 30 million barrels. And even with everything that's happened, Iran has still been keeping somewhere close to 18 million barrels sitting there in tanks. So when people talk about Kharg Island, they're not talking about some minor outpost. They're talking about the single point of failure for the entire Iranian economy. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this isn't the first time Kharg has been in the crosshairs. Back in March, when this war was still relatively fresh, the US Air Force conducted a massive bombing raid on Kharg Island, hitting more than 90 separate Iranian military sites in a single night. And I want you to sit with that number for a second. 90 plus targets on one island in one raid. That's not a surgical strike, that's a systematic dismantling. What got hit specifically were the military installations, the storage facilities being used for naval mines, the missile batteries that Iran had positioned there to help enforce its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. But here's the part that matters for where we are today. The oil infrastructure itself, the actual tanks, the loading terminals, the pipelines, all of that was deliberately left untouched. The White House, at the time, called it one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East, and said every military target on the island had been, and I'm using their words here, totally obliterated. But they stopped short of touching the oil side of the equation, and the reasoning given was, quote, for reasons of decency. Iran, for its part, did not take that restraint as an act of goodwill. Tehran actually threatened to reduce American-linked oil facilities across the region to what they called a pile of ashes if the US ever did decide to hit the oil infrastructure directly. So even back in March, both sides understood exactly what was on the table and exactly what was being held back. So why hold back? Why bomb 90 military targets on an island and leave the actual economic engine standing right there in the middle of it? Well, this is where you have to start thinking like a strategist instead of just watching explosions on a screen. If you destroy Kharg's oil infrastructure completely, you're not just hurting Iran, you're triggering a global energy shock. Roughly a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas, and a huge chunk of global seaborne oil moves through the waters connected to this exact region. Wipe out Kharg's loading capacity entirely, and you send oil prices into a spiral that hits every single country on Earth, including the United States, including all of Washington's own allies who are already dealing with fuel price pressure from this conflict. So there's a real economic tightrope being walked here. The US wants to strangle Iran's ability to fund its military and its proxy network, but it doesn't necessarily want to be the one that sets off a worldwide oil price catastrophe by leveling the terminal outright. That tension, that push and pull between maximum pressure and controlled escalation, is exactly what's been playing out for months now, and it's exactly why Kharg keeps coming back into the headlines every few weeks, instead of just getting settled one way or the other. And it's worth remembering, this isn't even the first time in Kharg's history that it's been treated as a legitimate wartime target. Back during the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein hit the island repeatedly, and it actually knocked the terminal out of commission for stretches at a time, forcing Iran to shift its shipping over to smaller, less capable facilities at Lavin Island and Siri Island just to keep some oil moving. Even a declassified CIA document from back in 1984 described Kharg's facilities as, quote, the most vital in Iran's oil system, and said their continued operation was essential to Iran's economic well-being. So this isn't some new theory people are floating in 2026. Military planners have understood for over 40 years that if you want to bring Iran's economy to its knees without a full-scale invasion, Kharg Island is the pressure point you go after. What's different this time is the technology doing the pressuring. Back in the 80s, it was Iraqi jets flying low over open water. Today, it's satellite tracking firms like Kepler and Windward watching every single tanker movement in real time, cross-referencing berth activity, loading schedules, and vessel positioning down to the hour, which is exactly how we know with this level of precision that the Western terminal went 22 straight days without a loading. There's nowhere left for Iran to hide this kind of economic damage. The whole world can watch it happen in near real time on a laptop. Let's talk about the blockade piece, because this is honestly the more interesting story right now, more interesting than any single air raid, because it's slower, it's quieter, and it's strangling Iran in a way that doesn't require a single bomb to fall. Back in April, the US formally imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports after talks had collapsed. Since then, US Central Command has been running an operation that has intercepted somewhere around 85 vessels, seized at least 3 ships outright, and redirected dozens of others away from Iranian waters entirely. Iran has retaliated by seizing a couple of cargo ships of its own, but the numbers just aren't symmetrical. The US estimates this blockade alone is costing Iran roughly $500 million a day. $500 million a day, just gone, just evaporated, because the tankers can't move the way they used to. And you can see the actual physical proof of this if you look at what shipping intelligence firms have been reporting out of Kharg itself. As of the most recent reporting, all 3 loading terminals on the island have been sitting empty for extended stretches. The western terminal went 22 straight days without a single loading. The liquid petroleum gas terminal went 13 days. The eastern terminal went 10 days. There have been no departures from Kharg at all since the end of July. And get this, there are currently around 17 tankers just sitting at anchor near the island, and none of them are even broadcasting their position. They're going dark. Ships don't go dark near a war zone unless somebody's worried about becoming a target, or unless somebody doesn't want the world watching what they're doing. So think about what that actually means on the ground in Iran right now. You have a country that depends on Kharg for basically its entire export economy, and that terminal has gone functionally silent. Iranian state media has tried to spin this. Back at the end of July, one of their outlets described Kharg as, quote, a successful model of resilience and crisis management. But if you read between the lines of their own coverage, they've quietly stopped talking about export volumes altogether and started talking instead about just keeping the infrastructure operational for eventual future use. That's not the language of a country that's doing fine. That's the language of a country that's trying to manage a narrative around an economic wound that isn't healing. It's also worth pointing out just how this whole war actually started, because I think a lot of people jumped into this conflict midstream and never got the full origin story, and it matters for understanding why Kharg has become such a symbolic target. This all kicked off on February 28th, when the US and Israel launched coordinated surprise airstrikes on Iranian military and government targets, and that opening night included the assassination of Iran's supreme leader at the time. That's about as decapitating a first strike as you can possibly launch against a regime, and Iran's response was to immediately slam the Strait of Hormuz shut, laying mines, boarding merchant vessels, attacking tankers, basically weaponizing the single most important shipping choke point on the planet in retaliation. At one point during that crisis, you had at least 17 merchant ships damaged, several of them abandoned outright by their crews, 2 ships captured, and more than a dozen seafarers killed or missing. That's the environment this entire Kharg situation grew out of. It wasn't just some isolated economic squeeze that appeared out of nowhere. It was the direct continuation of a full-blown regional war that started with a leadership decapitation strike and immediately spiraled into a global shipping crisis. Understanding that origin point helps explain why nobody in Washington is treating Kharg as some minor side operation. It's the latest chapter in a conflict that began with about as aggressive an opening move as modern warfare gets. Now let's talk about why people are specifically expecting something bigger to happen soon, because this is where the title of this video comes from, and I want to walk you through the actual timeline of threats and statements because it tells a story all on its own. Back in late March, President Trump told the Financial Times directly that the US could take Kharg Island, quote, very easily, and he said flatly that he didn't think Iran had any real defenses left on it worth worrying about. That same week, he floated publicly, on the record, the idea of the US actually seizing the island and other oil infrastructure points, saying America would, quote, assume total control of their oil and gas markets. That's not normal rhetoric. That's not just a president venting frustration. That is a sitting American president openly discussing regime-level economic seizure of a foreign nation's primary export asset. Then in June, he escalated that same language again, warning that the US would be taking Kharg Island as part of a broader effort to hit Iran, quote, very hard. Then in July, after a brief ceasefire period that Trump himself declared, quote, over, strikes resumed, and CENTCOM reported hitting more than 60 boats belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in a single operation. And just weeks after that, Trump posted an AI-generated image online referencing a strike on Kharg specifically, which, whatever you think about the messaging strategy there, tells you the island has stayed front and center in his own thinking the entire time. And now, here we are in August, with talks essentially frozen. Iran has publicly stated it is not currently engaging in negotiations with Washington. Trump, on his end, has said the U.S. is deliberately low-keying things right now, but he's also said Iran would need to provide some form of compensation as a condition before any real talks resume. That's a pretty significant shift in posture. That's not a president trying to de-escalate. That's a president setting terms from a position where he clearly believes the leverage sits entirely on the American side. And when you combine that rhetoric with the fact that Kharg's terminals are already sitting empty because of the blockade, with the fact that Iran has zero real air defense capability left to speak of after everything that's already been destroyed, and with the fact that this administration has floated outright seizure multiple separate times over multiple separate months, you start to see why so many analysts, so many open source intelligence accounts, and honestly, so many people inside the region itself are bracing for the next chapter of this to be much bigger than another overnight airstrike. So let's actually get into what huge would look like here, because there's a difference between another bombing run and something that qualifies as a genuine escalation. The assets are already positioned for exactly that kind of jump if the order comes down. In the water right now, you've got guided missile destroyers like the USS Mitcher and the USS Roosevelt operating in and around the region. And those platforms alone bring serious vertical launch missile capacity to the table. You've also got literal combat ships, specifically the USS Canberra, the USS Tulsa, and the USS Santa Barbara, all fitted with mine countermeasure packages. And that detail matters enormously, because if this operation ever moves from air power alone into an actual amphibious or ground element, the first problem you run into is Iran mining the approaches. Iran has already shown throughout this entire war that sea mines are one of their go-to tools, laying them across shipping lanes to choke off the strait whenever they feel cornered. Having dedicated mine countermeasure ships already forward deployed tells you the Navy has been thinking about this exact scenario. A scenario where American or Allied forces need to physically get close to Kharg without getting blown up by a minefield Iran laid months ago and never bothered mapping publicly. Then you've got the submarine piece, which is always the part people underestimate because you genuinely can't see it happening until it's already happened. The Navy operates 4 Ohio-class guided missile submarines: the Ohio, the Florida, the Michigan, and the Georgia. And each one of these things can carry up to 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. Just sit with that number. One submarine, 154 cruise missiles. The USS Georgia specifically already has a track record in this exact theater, having launched more than 30 Tomahawks at targets in Isfahan during earlier strikes in this campaign. And here's the thing that should really catch your attention. Back in September of last year, before any of this had even kicked off, the Navy quietly pulled the Ohio and the Florida off the fiscal year deactivation list, meaning boats that were supposed to be heading toward retirement got preserved instead. That's not a coincidence. That's a service branch looking at a brewing regional conflict and deciding it needed to keep maximum standoff strike capacity in reserve. So when people ask what could hit Kharg Island hard and fast without putting a single pilot at risk, the honest answer is submarines that are already somewhere in that theater right now, capable of launching more ordnance in a single salvo than most air wings could deliver in a night. And doing it from underwater where Iran has essentially zero ability to detect or intercept them. On top of all that, you've had a genuine troop buildup. Back in the spring, roughly 2,500 U.S. Marines were already deployed into the region, with a similar number reported as actively en route at the time. That's not the footprint of a country planning to just keep doing standoff airstrikes forever. Marines on the ground, even in a supporting or contingency role, signal planning for something with an actual physical territorial dimension to it. And when you stack that troop presence next to Trump's own repeated public statements about literally taking Kharg Island, not just striking it, taking it, you start to see a fuller picture of what huge might actually mean here. It could mean a strike campaign that finally does hit the oil infrastructure directly instead of sparing it. It could mean a full naval interdiction that physically stops every tanker near the island rather than just discouraging most of them. Or, and this is the scenario that gets floated most often by people who track this closely, it could mean some form of limited seizure or occupation of the terminal itself, using Marines backed by naval gunfire and air cover, specifically to put the entire facility under direct American or Allied control, rather than just denying Iran the ability to use it. Now, before you get too far down that road, I do want to give you the honest counterweight here, because A full seizure carries real risk, and the people planning this know it just as well as any analyst watching from the outside. If American troops end up occupying Kharg Island, you're putting them roughly 21 miles off the Iranian coast, sitting in a fixed, stationary position, well within range of whatever drones and missiles Iran still has left in its inventory. And even after everything that's been destroyed, Iran has shown throughout this war that it can still generate drone and rocket attacks, still find gaps, still get lucky hits in. Occupying fixed terrain that close to a hostile coastline is a fundamentally different risk profile than flying a strike package in and out in a single night. Pilots come home, an occupying force sits there and becomes a target every single day it stays. So there's a real argument inside the Pentagon, and honestly a real argument you'll see in open source defense circles, that seizing Kharg outright might actually create more long-term vulnerability than it solves, even while it delivers the short-term win of completely shutting off Iran's oil revenue. There's also the pure economic argument on the other side of the ledger, and I think this one gets underweighted in a lot of the coverage. If Kharg's oil infrastructure gets destroyed or seized outright, and its 90% export share simply vanishes from the global market overnight, you're not just hurting Iran, you're triggering a genuine worldwide price shock. Alternative Iranian export routes exist on paper, places like the Jask terminal on the Gulf of Oman, that Iran opened a few years back specifically to bypass the strait entirely. But the International Energy Agency has been pretty blunt that Jask has never been tested at anywhere near the scale that would be needed to replace Kharg's volume. So if Kharg goes down completely, there's no real backup for Iran to lean on. And that's exactly why this decision keeps getting talked about publicly but keeps getting held back from actually happening. It's a decision that ripples through the entire global economy, not just through Tehran. Now let's talk about what happens on Iran's side of this, because they haven't just been sitting there hoping for the best. Reporting out of the region indicates Iran has been actively fortifying Kharg and laying additional defensive traps in anticipation of exactly this kind of ground-level operation. Think about the pattern we've already seen play out across this entire war. Iran builds interconnected tunnel networks. Iran disperses its assets rather than concentrating them in obvious locations. Iran relies on proxy tactics, small boats, drones, mines. Rather than trying to fight a symmetrical war, it knows it cannot win against American air power. There's no reason to think Kharg is being defended any differently. Even with next to no functioning air defense left on the island itself, you can bet there are hidden positions, dispersed anti-ship capabilities, and probably a minefield or two sitting in the approaches, specifically designed to make any amphibious or ground-based seizure attempt as costly as possible for whoever tries it. This is the same insurgent-style playbook Iran has run throughout this entire conflict, just scaled down and concentrated onto one single incredibly valuable piece of coral rock in the Gulf. And you have to give Iran some credit here, at least tactically, because the entire structure of their remaining defense strategy across this war has revolved around denial rather than confrontation. They know they cannot win an open engagement against American carrier air wings, against F-35s running distributed aperture sensors that see in every direction at once, against destroyers carrying vertical launch cells packed with interceptors. So instead they lean entirely into the harder problem, the problem of making any approach expensive and unpredictable rather than trying to actually stop it outright. A mine you can't see costs the other side time, costs them mine countermeasure ships, costs them caution. A dispersed missile battery hidden in a civilian-looking structure costs the other side an intelligence cycle just to locate it. None of that stops an American operation from eventually succeeding, but it raises the price. It slows the timeline, and in a war where global oil markets are watching every single move in real time, slowing the timeline down might be the only card Iran has left to play. It's the exact same logic we've seen play out everywhere else in this war, whether it's the man-portable systems Iran has tried smuggling in through shadow companies, or the tunnel networks connecting their bunker sites further inland. Deny, delay, disperse, and hope the political cost of a full seizure eventually outweighs the economic gain of actually carrying it out. There's one more angle worth digging into here, and it's the human and economic reality inside Iran itself, because it's easy to talk about barrels and dollars and forget there's an entire population living underneath this pressure campaign. $500 million a day isn't just an abstract number on a spreadsheet somewhere in Washington. That's fuel subsidies that stop getting paid, that's currency that keeps losing value, that's a government that has to choose between funding its military and proxy networks or keeping basic goods affordable for ordinary Iranians, who had absolutely nothing to do with the decisions that started this war. And historically, when regimes like this one get squeezed this hard economically, the response isn't usually a graceful surrender at the negotiating table. It's usually a doubling down internally, tighter control, harsher crackdowns on dissent, because the leadership knows that a population feeling this kind of economic pain is a population that starts asking very uncomfortable questions about whether any of this was worth it. That's part of why Iran's own state media has shifted its messaging the way it has, moving away from talking about export volumes and toward talking about resilience and crisis management instead. It's not just a spin for the outside world, it's messaging aimed inward, trying to keep a population calm while their government's single largest source of national income sits completely idle for weeks at a time. So where does that leave us right now, today, as of this exact moment? The blockade is working, in the sense that Iran's export economy is functionally paralyzed. Every serious shipping intelligence source tracking Kharg right now is reporting the same thing. Terminals sitting empty, tankers going dark at anchor, departures that just stopped happening at the end of July and never resumed. Trump's rhetoric has shifted from threats of imminent strikes toward a more patient, economically driven posture, deliberately low-keying negotiations while demanding compensation before any real talks even start. And Iran, for its part, is refusing to engage, which either means they're calling what they see as a bluff, or it means internally they simply don't have anything left to offer that Washington would consider acceptable compensation for months of war. Either way, you have all the pieces of a bigger move sitting on the table. The military assets are in the water, the economic squeeze is already producing results without a single additional bomb being dropped, and the political rhetoric out of the White House has consistently, repeatedly, over a period of months, pointed toward Kharg Island specifically as the place where this entire conflict could take its next decisive turn. I think the honest way to read this whole situation is that the United States doesn't actually need to seize Kharg Island to win this particular fight. The blockade alone is already accomplishing most of what a physical occupation would accomplish, cutting off Iran's revenue, draining their ability to fund the IRGC and their proxy networks, and doing it without putting a single Marine in a fixed, exposed position 21 miles off a hostile coast. But the rhetoric, the troop positioning, the mine countermeasure ships, the submarines with their Tomahawk loadouts sitting somewhere in theater right now, all of that tells you the option is very much live, very much prepared, and very much sitting on the president's desk as something he could order with very short notice if he decides the slow squeeze isn't moving fast enough for him. And given how many times he's personally floated the idea publicly, on the record, across multiple months, from very easily taking it in March to hitting it very hard in June, to reviving the imagery again as recently as late July, I wouldn't bet against this escalating further before it de-escalates. What I'd really love to know is what you all think is actually going to happen here. Do you think this stays a slow economic strangulation, with the blockade doing all the heavy lifting while the White House just keeps talking tough without pulling the trigger on an actual seizure? Or do you think we're genuinely close to watching American Marines, backed by Navy firepower, actually go take physical control of that terminal, given everything Trump has said about it going all the way back to March? Drop your take in the comments. I read every single one of them, and honestly, some of you catch details in these situations that I completely missed. So I always learn something from the discussion down there. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening on the ground, and not just the headline version, is useful to you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps get this kind of analysis in front of more people who are trying to actually understand this conflict instead of just scrolling past another 30-second clip of an explosion with no context behind it. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe, because this Kharg Island story is nowhere near finished. There's another chapter coming, probably sooner rather than later given the pace we've seen over the last few months, and I'll be breaking it down the second it happens. Share this with anyone you know who's been asking what's actually going on with Iran right now, because honestly, this is one of the more important threads in the entire war, and it does not get nearly enough serious coverage compared to how much it actually matters for where this conflict goes next. Now let's zoom out for a second, because I think there's a bigger strategic picture worth connecting here before we wrap up. Every single move the U.S. has made around Kharg Island since this war started follows one consistent logic, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Hit the military targets hard enough to remove Iran's ability to defend the island, but hold back from the economic targets long enough to keep global oil markets from spiraling. Blockade the exports quietly and economically, rather than loudly and kinetically, because a blockade produces the same financial pain as a bombing campaign without any of the same political or humanitarian fallout. And keep floating the idea of outright seizure publicly over and over for months, not necessarily because it's the plan for next week, but because the constant threat of it keeps Iran guessing, keeps them spending resources fortifying a position that might never actually get attacked directly, and keeps the pressure compounding on a regime that is already bleeding $500 million a day from a blockade it can't break. That's not accidental. That's a deliberate, sustained pressure campaign. Kharg Island just happens to be the single visual, symbolic center of it. The one place where you can point to a satellite photo and say, look, there's the tanks, there's the terminals, there's 90% of a country's entire economy sitting on one small island, It's been sitting empty for weeks, and that, honestly, might be the most important thing to understand about where this goes next. Whether or not American boots ever actually step foot on Kharg Island, the island has already become the proof point of just how thoroughly Iran's position has collapsed since February. A country that used to move oil to nearly every corner of the globe now has 17 ghost ships sitting dark at anchor next to an empty terminal, waiting for a war that shows no sign of actually ending. Whatever comes next, whether it's another round of overnight strikes, a formal seizure operation, or just more months of the same quiet economic strangulation, Kharg Island is going to remain the place everyone watches first, because it's the one location in this entire conflict where you can measure, almost literally in barrels and dollars, exactly how much pressure Iran is actually under at any given moment. So keep an eye on this one, because I genuinely believe whatever happens on that island in the coming weeks is going to tell us more about how this war ends than almost anything else happening across the rest of the theater right now